But we saw problems, right? There are certain problems with behaviorism. One of them seems to be that, at least from a first person point of view, I feel as though my pain, the pain that I feel when I pinch myself, is different from the behavior. So, and the pain that I feel is a mental state. Right? It's the mental state that makes me say ow. It's the mental state that is caused by something physical in the environment. What is the status of that mental state? Well, the positivists and the behaviorists just sort of didn't want to deal with it because it seemed too difficult of a thing. It doesn't seem as though it's publicly observable, that inner subjective feeling of pain. The only thing that's publicly observable is behavior, right? So on the one hand, they're focusing on something particular because they're trying to be more scientific. On the other hand, you might argue that something's being left out. And so mind brain identity theory maybe will do better. We'll see. Okay. This is one of the slides that I cannot use my phone as a remote for, so I have to switch back and forth. Let me make the window bigger for the people watching because the window changes. It's all boring technical stuff that's not interesting, but I want to make sure that the people watching it later can see everything as well. Okay, here we go. Okay, you ready? There we go. That's kind of fun, right? Uh, so a little bit after the behaviorists, kind of in the middle of the 50s. At this point, philosophers and scientists are looking back, and the idea of dualism is still seen as kind of problematic. It's scientifically not really feasible because dualism would mean that we cannot study the mind scientifically. And it's philosophically problematic because of the problems that we saw with the interaction. If the mind is actually an immaterial soul without any kind of location or any kind of physical contact with the physical world, then how can it act on the physical world? Especially given the idea that we get from physics that all physical behavior is caused by other physical behavior, right? And that would include your own bodily actions. So dualism is still seen as problematic. So people are trying to get away from that picture, right? You see, this is the picture of Descartes, sort of being inhabited by his own ghost, right? This is the idea that that philosopher Gilbert Ryle ridiculed as the doctrine of the ghost and the machine, because that's sort of what dualism is, right? The body is this machine, but then the soul is the consciousness which inhabits it in some way, like the driver in a vehicle, except that the driver has no location, no extension, no proximity to the actual vehicle. It cannot be inside the vehicle because it's supposed to be immaterial. Yeah, so we see some problems, right? Sometimes this view is also related to what's known as the homunculus problem, which happens anytime you try to think about how the mind perceives the world around it. You sort of have to end up imagining this little version of you inside your own mind that's looking at all the pictures being presented to you by your brain. But then, of course, that raises the question, what is that little person? Where's that little person? How is that little person observing anything? Well, does that little person also have a little person inside of them? And so on. You see the problem. Okay, I probably went over that too fast, but idea being here in the 50s, dualism still not cool. At least not from a scientific point of view. Behaviorism seems a bit too limited as well, right? This idea that all we can really do is study the inputs and the outputs, and what's in the mind, the mental states themselves. Well, either they don't exist to begin with, they're just nonsense, or we just cannot talk about them as a methodological sort of issue. But that does seem to leave this problem of, well, sometimes it seems as though I have access to my own black box as in the case of pain, for example, right, where you only observe the inputs and the outputs. Maybe you saw the tack that I stepped on, and then you see my ow behavior. But in between, there is something really real happening. Pain, the sensation of pain. So, where is an explanation of that sensation on behaviorism? There just isn't one, right? At least that's a kind of a critique that you might level against them. Okay. So, and at the same time, in the 50s, technology had been developing, right? That was not available earlier. Technology that allows us to see what is happening within a functioning brain, right? So there's both technology that's allowing us to slice up old brains to see what the different parts look like and to start making correlations. There's also studies that allow us to inject a human with a substance that then can show up on some sort of scan device. And so over time, human beings have invented all sorts of brain scan machines, different types that work in different ways. And they all seem to show that there's areas of specialization in the brain, or at the very least, we know from abnormal psychology that abnormal behavior, abnormal experiences are correlated with some sort of brain abnormality, right? The example that gets talked a lot about here is Phineas Gage. This is a guy quite a while ago had a railroad spike driven through his head, and he survived it. But ever since that incident happened, his whole personality changed completely. It wasn't just the type of personality change that you would expect given some sort of trauma, right? Some sort of PTSD. It wasn't really like that. His entire personality changed. And we see all sorts of examples like this, all sorts of cases of some sort of brain damage then correlates with some sort of behavioral or experiential issue or problem. That there are specific areas in the brain, or think of other, horrible, terrible diseases like Alzheimer's, which seem to erase a person's identity over time entirely by getting rid of their memories and their ability to know where they are and what they're doing. This is all associated with degenerating brains. There's some sort of problem in the brain that is making this happen. So we start to see over time just how important this organ is. That it seems to be directly responsible for lots and lots of different mental functions. Okay. So then, philosophers at this time, who are paying attention, and this is going to, of course, be physicalist philosophers with a scientific kind of approach to philosophical problems. Right? So these are not going to be people who are dualists. These are not going to be people who believe in an immaterial soul, right? These are philosophers that have seen the history of the philosophy of mind and who understand what's happening in psychology and in brain science in general, who are then trying to put together a new picture, something that's a bit better than behaviorism and something that's a lot better than dualism. And this is the basic idea. It is simply that what we've been calling mental states. Right? Remember, I've been saying mental states just as a catch-all term, where we're not specifying what mental states are, what their nature is, but we just come up with different examples of them. Right? So being in pain is a mental state. Imagining that you're in Paris is a mental state. Right? These are all mental states. Well, what sorts of things are mental states? Right? According to the mind-brain identity theorists, they are simply brain states. They are states that the brain can be in. It's really that simple. So, think about different brain states you might have. And the idea is that for each of those brain states that we can talk about, in our folk psychology, remember the whole idea of folk psychology, right? We assume about ourselves and about other people that they have various mental states that explain their behavior. Right? And so you might talk about someone wanting ice cream, or someone being in pain, or someone believing that there's beer in the fridge. These are the ways that in which we explain other people's behavior to ourselves and our own behavior to ourselves. It's a way that makes it intelligible to interact with other human beings. Right? We carry around this kind of folk psychology, and so we will talk about wanting and thinking and feeling and perceiving, all these different types of mental processes or mental states. The main mind-brain identity theorist says, well, look, when you actually study scientifically what is happening, these are just brain states. Right? It is just what it is like for a human being to be in that particular brain state. That is the same as, for example, wanting ice cream or thinking about Paris. There's going to be some sort of brain state that's identical with those. Right, so if you remember folk psychology, right, I just mentioned this, just our everyday, not an entirely scientific way of thinking, not necessarily bad either, it's just not rigorous or scientific, it's just how we ordinarily, automatically sort of do things, right? We think about other people's behaviors in terms of their mental states. Well, the identity theorist says that all those folk psychology statements, those sort of informal, colloquial ways of talking about mental states, they can all really be translated in a way to a scientific statement about brain states in general. Right? So, for example, think about water. A brain state could be a combination of brain states. Yeah, of different brain states of different people, Parker, or your own brain states. There is a little bit of an ambiguity with a brain state, right? How long does a brain state last? Sometimes I think let's not worry about that too much, right? We can think of processes as well, where it's a series of states. But you could be thinking of some sort of uber brain. Maybe you're thinking ahead of everything else. So I'm not sure, but you might be right, Parker. There's different ways of cashing out that statement. Oh, I see. Yes, right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that is going to be the case, and I might as well say that, right? I mean, they're not. None of them are thinking that it's going to be a simple sort of state in your brain. Your brain there's all sorts of stuff happening, right? But it's just that feeling a pain or thinking about Paris. There's some sort of state within your brain that is correlated with that. And they are saying it's not only correlated with it, it's actually the same thing. Right? Yeah. So, we've been talking about water in an sort of an ordinary way for a long time, right? Human beings, we've known about water. We've had words for water. We have all sorts of ways of talking about water that are familiar to us. Right, we can talk about the way that water is wet, or it becomes a solid when it's cold enough. We can talk about all its different properties and the way that it appears to us. That's our folk theory of water, right? We have a folk theory of water that you have just by virtue of being a human being who's been around water. You understand if you go underneath water, you can't breathe, things like that. We need water to survive. You know all sorts of things about water. But they're not all particularly scientific, right? So all those statements could be translated into just very scientific statements about H2O, right? So if you wanted to do the science of water, you'd go beyond the folk theories of water, right? You have to get to somehow to the physical structure of H2O, of water, and how it works. And so then we know water, this thing that we've been talking about all this time, we didn't know it was H2O, but now we understand water has these two hydrogen molecules and an oxygen molecule. They're combined in just such a way, and because of that small structure, that microstructure, because of that, that's what explains all the properties that water has. All these things that we've been talking about in our ordinary language, its wetness and its liquidity and the way that it freezes and all this stuff, we've been talking about this stuff in our non-scientific vocabulary, but you could translate all that into purely scientific vocabulary. So now we know that water, this thing that we talk about, it really is just a bunch of H2O molecules. And all the things we knew about water, whatever we were correct about, whatever the nature of water is, it's all explainable in terms of that structure that the H2O molecule has. That's what it explains why it becomes rigid when it's very cold, and why it steams up when it's very hot. That explains why it feels wet to the touch. That structure explains why we need it, why our bodies need this structure. We can go into a whole scientific account of what water is, even though we've always known about water, right? Water wasn't discovered. We know about water. It's just that we only know about water through our ordinary concepts. The scientists can then come along and translate those ordinary concepts into more well-defined scientific statements. So we know that water is just H2O. In the same way, perhaps we could say that the experience of pain is really just this particular parts of the brain acting up. Let's say they're C fibers, right? That's just an example. There is something called C fibers in the brain that's associated with pain. We're not really trying to get into the technicalities of what these brain states really look like. It's just an example, right? In the same way that we can look at the microstructure of water to truly understand what it is, in the same way we can look at pain and see what it is that physically composes pain. It is just a bunch of these C fibers, perhaps, or some other process in the brain. You see how they're meant to be analogous. I notice it's no objection to this to say, well, we talk about pain in a different way than we talk about C fibers firing. That's fine, because we also talk about water in a different way than we talk about H2O. When we talk about water in ordinary context, we're not being scientists, right? We're just being ordinary human beings, and we just have our practical purposes. That's why we talk about water, and I can ask you for a glass of water. Not being scientific. And then the same way I can feel pain and talk about my pain in various ways. That's all fine. Those are ordinary statements. But if you really want knowledge, if you want it to be well-defined, rigorous, and empirically tested, then let's hand it over to the scientists, and they'll tell us what this all really means, right? This is the idea. So it's a reductionist kind of idea, that ultimately what we really want is a scientific vocabulary to be able to talk about this stuff. Okay. Give me 1 minute here. Sorry, I just wanted to check something. I'll put it back up in just a sec. Huh. Okay, well, why should we think mind-brain identity theory is true, right? Uh, well, one of them is that identity, right? That's the basic idea here, is that the mind just is the brain, and that all talk about the mind and all talk about mental states can really be much better understood as statements about the brain and statements about brain states. We should get rid of the folk psychology part of it to a certain extent, and we do much better just using scientific statements. Well, because identity is a good explanation for the correlations between mental states and brain states, right? So if you think about those scans again, those brain scans, where especially now, I mean, mind-brain identity theory, this is already over half a century old, but nowadays there's so much scanning technology available that we really find these very strong correlations. If you very interesting stuff that to the point where you can have different test subjects go into one of these scans and they might be instructed to think about different things, like think about Jennifer Aniston, right? A random celebrity, and then a certain part of the brain lights up, and then somebody else does the same thing, the same part of the brain lights up, right? If you do this over and over, you keep seeing all these correlations. Whenever there's some sort of mental state, there's an associated physical state, some sort of brain states. If you notice this over and over and over, why not just simplify everything and say, well, identity explains correlation really, really well, right? It's not that's just that they're correlated, it's that they are actually the same thing. Right? So in the same way, again, going back to water, we now say that water just is H2O. That's pretty common for us to say. And why do we think that? Well, because whenever we find some water, whenever scientists get their hands on a sample of water, they find that part of its structure is that it's a bunch of H2O molecules, right? So it makes sense then to say water is H2O, right? It's the same kind of correlation. So if whenever you find pain, you actually end up finding these C fibers firing, then we could conclude that's just what pain is. Right? That's just what pain is. Pain is just these brain processes happening. And so far, if all we're looking at is dualism and behaviorism, neither of those has really explained these correlations between the mental states and the brain states. Right? Remember, dualism did not explain this. People had to come in after the fact, and they could only make it work by bringing God into it. Right? Then these strong correlations are explained by God, basically. Scientifically, of course, that's not satisfying to say that God did it. Right? There's a whole history. The history of human beings has been, oh, here's some mystery that I did not understand. A God must have done it, right? If that's your attitude, then you'll never find anything out about the world. So part of the scientific revolution is trying out other explanations, right? Seeing what else works. Don't just assume that it's a God just because you couldn't think of any other way that it would work, right? It's the same sort of thing here. From a scientific point of view, the only way to save dualism, which already had its problems anyway, is to then say, well, every time you have a perception, a miracle occurs, right? Or any time you decide to raise your hand, there's actually a supernatural being that is making sure that the actions of your bodily avatar are lining up with your intentions that you have in your immaterial soul somewhere. Not somewhere, nowhere, because it's not located, right? So dualism has a hard time coming up with these correlations in a non-ad hoc way. Ad hoc means you're sort of trying to fix it after the fact. Right? Dualism itself does not explain the correlations. In fact, that's one of the problems with it, and that's why people bring up occasionalism or the harmony theory, right, as a way to try to prop up the theory, as a way to try to save it from this problem. So dualism all by itself does not explain these correlations. Neither does behaviorism, right? Behaviorism pretty much just tries to shy away from talking about mental states at all, right? So far, if all we have is three theories and only one of them, mind-brain identity theory, actually explains these correlations that brain scans show us. But notice, it's just sort of a possibility, right? The mere fact that there's a correlation does not automatically mean that it's identity, right? I mean, because you could still be some sort of dualist. You could still think that whenever your conscious soul is going through something, there's also something happening in your brain, and they are correlated, but they're not the same, right? That's a possibility as well. But again, then you'd have to buy into dualism, which has its problems. And it seems as though mind-brain identity theory is very simple and elegant, right? It simply points out these correlations and then says, how could we explain that and then solve all these other problems as well? Let's just suppose that mental states are just brain states. The mind is just the brain. And we don't have this mind-body interaction problem like in dualism either. Because there's just the body. That's all there is. Mental processes are just physical processes, right? And there's no mystery there about how physical processes affect the physical world, right? That's just Newtonian mechanics can take care of that, right? One atom hits another atom and it bounces off or something like that, right? Just purely physical stuff happening in the physical world. So your bodily behavior, for example, we don't have to try to explain that in terms of an intention inside your immaterial soul that somehow has to try to affect your body. No, an intention is just a brain state, or perhaps a bunch of brain states or brain processes. Right? There, the vocabulary at this level doesn't matter that much. What we know is that we're talking about the brain and the things that it does. So if an intention or a desire is just a brain state, well, of course brain states can bring about physical effects in the body. We know all about that, right? The brain communicates via the nervous system to the rest of the body and can send signals to raise a hand. So then if my intention to raise a hand just is a brain process, then there's just no problem, right? It's just my brain telling my hand to go up. Whereas in dualism, that is completely mysterious, right? How could an immaterial intention and an immaterial soul that is not located anywhere near the body, how could that affect the body? Well, then you have to bring in God to do it somehow, right? You end up having this very elaborate kind of system with supernatural forces at work. Whereas on mind-brain identity theory, you get a very simple, elegant explanation of these correlations, and it solves the mind-body interaction problem. So, big argument is that it's an improvement over both dualism and behaviorism, right? So for behaviorism, for example, behaviorism, remember, just ignores or sometimes perhaps even denies the existence of these internal mental states. Mind-brain identity theory doesn't do that. We have mental states. It's just that they're not non-physical. Mental states are physical states of the brain. And it doesn't ascribe mental states to this sort of spooky thing, right? This non-physical substance that scientists can't study. No, mental states are just brain states. They're not states that your immaterial soul is in, right? Let's see. Oh, Parker, yeah, ad hoc, like saying something is true and then trying to find reasons why it's true. Yeah, that's a little bit more of a post hoc rationalization, right? Sorry, I misspelled rationalization there. A little, just a typo. Ad hoc is more like you have a theory, and the theory sounds nice all by itself, but then somebody says, oh, here's a huge problem for your theory. And then you try to come up with a way to add to your theory to try to solve it. Right? You're starting to tinker with your hypothesis. That's not good science usually. Yeah, so usually with science, you want your explanation to already be able to take care of all this stuff. Right? So dualism, it seems to explain some of our intuitions that we have, maybe. So dualism is attractive to a certain extent, but then you say, well, what about the mind-body problem? And dualism doesn't have an answer all by itself. The mere fact that you have two different kinds of substances in the world is not a theory for how those interact, right? It's completely lacking that theory. So then people after, to try to save dualism, had to come up with some sort of way to make it all work. And the way that they make it work is, well, let's say just God is doing it all, right? That's an ad hoc explanation or an ad hoc addition to your theory that you came up with after the fact, just to try to come up with a way to deal with a problem that your theory itself did not actually deal with, or to deal with the problem that your theory creates. Right? The mind-body problem is a problem created by dualism. We don't have that problem in mind-brain identity. Yeah. But it's very close. Ad hoc and it's very very kind of close. It's in either case you're sort of after the fact doing something. Yeah. A lot of times it happens when somebody's really invested in an idea, right? For perhaps non-rational reasons, right? You really like this idea, so then you come up with ways to prove that it's true, and then you come up with ways to fight off the problems. Yeah, see, they are indeed related in that way. Another argument for mind-brain identity theory is the completeness of physics. Right? The completeness of physics, this idea being that scientists, at least in physics, we sort of make this assumption that seems to be borne out. It's a lot like the assumptions that everything has a cause, right? Something like that. All physical effects have physical causes that are sufficient to bring those effects about. Right? So that if something physically happens in the world, it's because of some other physical factor. And in lots of ordinary cases, we know exactly what we're talking about, right? So if there's suddenly a big hole in my roof and I look and there's a giant branch crash through the roof, right? I can think about this in purely physical terms, right? This is physical event, something crashed through my roof and broke it. And then you think, oh, it's the tree that's hanging over our house, and it was windy, and I knocked one of the branches down. Yeah, that I can just explain physical things by the physical causes that brought them about. I think of anything that happens physically. I think about a car accident, right? There's some set of physical causes that made that happen. Why did the water boil? Well, you put it on top of a stove and turn the stove on. Any physical event that you can think about has some sort of physical cause. At least that's the idea. And now, if that's true, that is also going to be true of your bodily movements, your bodily behavior. Your body is a physical object in space, and it moves around. And that means that if something's happening, there was some sort of physical cause for it. And mind-brain identity theory can explain that, right? So if you start with the idea that all physical effects have physical causes, right, and given those physical causes you get the physical effects, then combine that with this idea from folk psychology, which is that mental phenomena or mental states, mental processes have effects in the physical world. Right, this is just an example of I want to raise my hand, so I raise my hand, right? I have a desire, that's the mental phenomena, and there's an effect in the physical world, my hand goes up. Well, you see, if both of those statements are true, if all physical effects have physical causes, where you only need those causes to bring about the effects, and if it's true that mental phenomena have effects in the physical world, which is what we intuitively think when we think about folk psychology, then that would have to mean that the mental phenomena that can cause physical things to happen are themselves just physical phenomena. Does everyone see how that follows? If it's true that everything physical that happens is brought about through something else physical, and if it's true that mental states have physical effects, right? You see what follows, right? If all physical effects have physical causes, and if some effects are caused by mental phenomena, it must mean that mental phenomena are physical phenomena. The only way you would get out of this conclusion is if you were to disagree with one of these premises, right? So you'd basically be disagreeing with the scientific consensus that physical effects have physical causes, right? If you agree with that, if you're on board with that, that things in the physical world have a physical explanation, then it would follow that mental phenomena are physical phenomena. Mental states are physical states, right? Mental processes are just brain processes. Okay, good so far? Any questions about what mind-brain identity theory says before I get into the problems of it? Do you get the basic idea? I mean, you might already have just sort of an intuitive reaction to this, where you might be following the argument, but you might still be thinking to yourself, hold on a minute. When I feel a pain subjectively, is that really identical with the brain state? Because I can quite imagine having a brain state of some sort and not caring at all, right? I only care about pain when it feels painful. And is the feeling of pain, maybe it's hard to conceptualize that as a brain state. Now, that's not a complete, well thought out criticism of mind-brain identity theory, okay? It's just sort of an intuitive hang-up you might have a little bit. You might think, yeah, but what about when I feel that feeling or feel that emotion, right? Is it really just the brain state? Now, when you start talking about things like love, right, then people really start to get a little sketched out about reductionism, right? Reductionism being the idea that everything in the world reduces down to basic components like atoms or something like that, right? Where we're all pretty okay with reductionism when it comes to cups and cans and trees, right? Yeah, these are all composed of atoms, and that's all they really are. We've talked about this a lot, right? These are just different ways that atoms can be configured. But now this is saying if you get the right configuration of atoms, you get love, you get happiness, you get joy, you get pain, right? And you might have this intuition, the very intuition that leads people towards dualism, right? This intuition that they can't be the same thing. Mental phenomena are different, just the way that their experience is different than physical. Yeah. So I'm just flagging that ahead of time. I'm sort of aware that people might have that intuition. Right. Yeah. So Parker's talking about, but again, it correlates, right? Right. Yeah. But all you can really say that there's a correlation, and the mind-brain identity theorist says, well, that correlation is most easily explained by identity, right? By saying that it's the same thing. But you could still, if you really wanted to hold on to dualism, you could explain it, but it might be in this sort of ad hoc way, right? You might, for example, say that your soul is just pure consciousness, but it still needs some sort of input from the physical world, and the body is required for that, and the brain is required for that, right? So you might think that in order for your soul to get a signal from the outside world, that you do need it to go, the signal to go into your eyes, and your brain then processes it all, and we can measure all that, and then once that product is all done, then the soul gets it. Then the soul gets to see it. Well, I say here's the problem, of course, that homunculus theory, right? Because okay, then the soul experiences it. How does the soul do it, right? Does the soul have a mind that we then need to explain as well? Anyway, what I was saying is not that. I was just saying that a dualist could try to explain these things you're talking about, Parker. Yeah. But it's a matter of which theory sort of fits more nicely, which one has the least amount of overall problems, right? I don't know that these strong correlations are a knockout argument against dualism. I think the dualists could still say there's a logical way to think about this, a logical possibility where there's just a very strong correlation between what I feel in my soul and what's happening in my brain. And there's some reason for it, but it's not identity, right? You might try to argue that way. But then you have all the problems that dualism has. Right, yeah, correlation, yeah, exactly. It doesn't, yeah, have to be. And the thing is, in this case, we're not saying. I think the dualist would be more likely to say that this correlation is causation. So I don't know if you were doing the negative through the equals. I just see an exclamation mark. But it's true. Correlation and causation are not necessarily the same, right? Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're just accidentally correlated for some other reason. And sometimes they're correlated because not a big causation, but because of identity, right? I think the dualist is going to have to say that correlation between the brain and the mind is actually causal, right? That somehow that stuff happening in your brain is causing you to experience things in your soul, and things in your soul are causing you to behave a certain way in the physical realm. Something like that. But yeah, those are the relevant terms, right? Is it causation, identity, something else? Yeah. Well, the big problems are the problems that every physicalist theory of mind is going to have. Okay? So remember, we're looking at various physicalist theories. We're mostly going to look just at the first three. We're mostly just going to look at behaviorism, identity theory, and functionalism. But there are various different theories on the table that are all physicalist. And any of these physicalist theories are going to have the same kind of problem, which is that intuitive idea that the feeling of a pain just isn't a physical thing, right? The qualitative aspect of conscious experience, what it is like to feel something, what it is like to be in a certain state, what it is like to be a human being having these emotions, right? For many people, they're going to have the intuition that those things are not reducible down to a combination of atoms, right? But that's ultimately what all these physicalist theories will say, right? All the physicalist theories will say it's because of the brain, right? And the brain is ultimately just a collection of atoms, right? This is that leveled reality that we looked at. Atoms, and atoms combine into molecules, and molecules combine into cells, and so on. Your brain is just an organ composed of a bunch of cells. And it is because of those cells, which are ultimately made of atoms, that you are able to have any mental state at all. Right? So any physicalist theory is going to have that problem because many people do not accept that. Many people think that it's just not thinkable that a pain could actually just be a configuration of atoms, that there has to be something else going on. So let's not look at those general objections. We'll look at those later. General objections to physicalism. Let's just look at the one that's particular to mind-brain identity theory. And this is the problem of multiple realizability. I know this is kind of a jargony thing. I like to avoid jargon when I can. But, it makes sense that this is what it's called, as you'll see. The idea is not that difficult. The concept or the word looks difficult, but it's not that difficult. Multiple realizability is just the idea that different physical systems could realize, or in other words, create or constitute the same mental states. Okay, I'll give you an example. An octopus, for example, it might be able to feel sensations, right? An octopus, I can imagine it feeling pain. Octopi are supposed to be very intelligent and sensitive, and I could imagine it engaging in some sort of pain behavior when you pinch its tentacle. I can imagine an octopus being in quite a lot of pain. But of course, octopus brains are completely different from ours. Right? So then, if we can be in the same brain state, being in pain, for example, and pain is identical with the brain state, well, that wouldn't work, would it? If it's literally numerically identical with a certain kind of brain state, but the octopus has a completely different kind of brain. Right? Do you see the problem here? Then pain could not be identical with a particular brain state, because a different creature with a different kind of physical system might be able to have the same kinds of sensations. You see? Another example would just be something like an alien, right? They might have a totally different kind of chemical makeup altogether. Maybe they're not even carbon-based. But you know, if I see an alien for some reason, right, and I'm not freaked out about it, I see an alien step on a tack, and it goes, you know, it starts swearing and clutching its foot. It makes a bit of sense to say the alien is in pain, like me, right? That's what would happen to me as well. It's feeling pain. But of course, if pain were literally identical with my brain state, then the alien couldn't have pain because its states are completely different. It might not even have a brain in its skull like we do, right? It might have all sorts of different components of its nervous system distributed throughout its whole body, right? So the idea is that you could have a completely different physical system that can realize the same mental states. The analogy that we'll look at next time when we look at functionalism, you can think about a mousetrap. When you think of a mousetrap, you think that it's identical with one of those old-timey, old-fashioned ones, right? Where the little piece of cheese and the mouse goes on it and it goes plop. Well, no, mousetrap is not identical with just that contraption, right? There's all sorts of different ways that you can make a mousetrap. You may have misinterpreted what brain identity is. Yes, maybe, but maybe not. It's also possible that this objection has misinterpreted what it is. It's very difficult to keep track of all this because there's well-known objections to mind-brain identity theory, but then also those identity theorists come back and try to deal with those objections. So a lot of what I'm presenting is sort of what's historically people take to be the picture, the overall story. You could argue with any of this stuff, right? So you might actually know what it is and be correct. This is just one of the ways of cashing out a potential problem. And honestly, I don't think there's a huge difference between functionalism and mind-brain identity theory. Right? I mean, you could look at what you could say in response. You could just say that it's actually not a problem at all. You could say, well, what I meant by identity theory is something like this. For every mental state, it's identical with some sort of brain state, right? For any human mental state. An octopus mental states is identical with octopus brain states, right? So it just sort of depends. So this is a way you could come at it, but think about this though. What is it that makes it a pain, right? So for example, if an octopus is in pain and I am in pain, why do we call it both the same thing, given that the brain states are different? Why are they both pains? Now here's where the functionalist is going to shine. The functionalist is going to say, yeah, it is the physical systems, they are important, but you can have different physical systems instantiate the same types of functionalities in different ways, right? What matters is the role that pain is playing in the organism. What matters is that it was caused by the environment and it is then causes some kind of behavior. Right? So we're a little bit back to behaviorism in a sense, except that we're now talking about the mental states as very important things, as the translators between input to output. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The idea here just is the mind-brain identity theorist could say, well, I don't mean pain is always a human brain state. I just mean that it's whatever state the organism is in. You could say that, but that would mean that pain cannot be identified with the underlying system, because you and I could have different underlying systems and still be in pain. Me and the alien could both be having a horrible stomach ache, but the physical system that realizes that stomach ache might be completely different from them to me. So what is the same there? Why do we call them both pains? Well, it would not be because of the underlying brain states, because those are different. You see what's happening here? Whereas the functionalists can say they are identical. We both have pain because of the role that pain is playing in the organism. And that's what's really important. So, getting ahead a little bit to functionalism, right? So this is, we're pretty much done here anyway. This is setting up, why you would go to functionalism rather than mind-brain identity theory. And in many cases, they're almost the same idea. It's just being a little bit more careful, because you have to be careful. And in this case, I do see where the functionalist is coming from. So the functionalist is still going to say, for human beings, it's the brain that allows them to have any kind of consciousness or mental states at all. It's just that the functionalist is not going to make as tight of an identity statement between the brain states and the mental states. It's rather going to be a functional state and a mental state that get identified. But the functional state can be realized in different types of physical systems. Another one, just to get ahead as well, it's something like artificial intelligence. You see? Let's talk about a different mental state. Figuring out the sum of 2 plus 2. Are you intelligent enough to add 2 plus 2? Intelligence is kind of a mental term. Well, sure I am. I can do it. 2 plus 2 equals 4. But my phone is smart enough to do that as well. Why? Because its physical system allows it to compute 2 plus 2 equals 4. Completely different physical system than mine, right? So the intelligence required for adding sums together cannot be literally identical with my brain states or with my brain, because a completely different system could do the same thing. Right? So this is the problem with identity theory. It creates too strong of a link between the physical system that happens to be underlying our mental processes some moral issues having to do with mental states of machines, right? Yeah, and we'll get to that a little bit when we get to functionalism, because there it's really going to be more about that sort of a thing, right? Yeah, could a machine have intelligence or consciousness? Right? If you're a dualist, then no, not unless God somehow attaches a consciousness to a machine, right? But all by itself, it could not be, because to be conscious or intelligent is to be a soul for dualism. So in that case, a computer or a robot could never be conscious or intelligent. On identity theory, you might say the same thing, right? If they're saying that pain is identical with a brain state, or feeling and emotion is identical with brain states, well, they're not talking about computer states, are they? They're talking about brain states. So mind-brain identity theory would also rule out the possibility of artificial intelligence. But again, there might be an interpretation problem here. Sometimes I wonder if the mind-brain identity theorists were being misinterpreted. Yeah, there's just a lot going for functionalism as just an kind of an easier way to deal with all these things. Yeah. I say today I think we can be done early. Sometimes I make you go really late, and I think we're catching up okay. Catching up means we're about a week behind rather than 2 weeks behind. I'm always a week behind. That's fine. um, so let's stop here. This is enough for you to chew on probably. And then on Thursday we'll do functionalism. Okay. But yeah, you might want to think about a little bit what your own point of view is on this. Now that you've thought about it for a while and you've seen a few different theories floating around. I think, Parker, you're saying you're very much in line with this sort of physicalist approach already, right? You might find out which one of these theories you like the best. But all these theories have in common that they're physicalist as opposed to dualism, right? Whereas dualism says there's the physical world and an entirely immaterial realm. Yeah. And yeah, and this fits into the different ways of human beings, of how we see ourselves, right? Yeah, and for some people think that if there is no immortal soul, then the world is just a cold, dead, ugly place or something like that. That's not necessarily true, right? You can have a view known as romantic naturalism, where you see the natural world and still see it as a beautiful and amazing thing. And here you are. You know, it is amazing that atoms can be configured in such a way as to give rise to consciousness. It could still be really cool, but for some people it's too reductionistic, and they think that there's such wonderful stuff like consciousness and love and things like that, that it's not possibly reducible down to atoms moving in the void, right? You know. Okay, let's end there. But yeah, Parker, that's right. What Parker is saying is true, right? All the elements of the universe were created in these early stages of the universe, and we are carbon based life forms. Yeah. Okay, that was a quick one today.
You are currently the only person in this conference.